Hi, everybody. Welcome to the recorded lecture for Teaching the American Tradition for Friday, June 19th, 2026. We're going to start off today by talking about Crèvecoeur, J. Hector Saint Jean de Crèvecoeur, to be exact, and his letter, What is an American?, which is the third letter in a series of letters from this book that you can see on the right here. This book was published pseudonymously by a Pennsylvania farmer who had in fact lived in America and worked as a farmer and a surveyor. He had also lived in upstate New York, and he had traveled back and forth to France. So he did not spend all of his time as a farmer, though he was an immigrant and a naturalized immigrant to the United States. This work became very popular, especially in Europe after it was published, and especially in more liberal circles. And it's easy to see why. It has a universalizing tendency. It emphasizes detachment from old customs and forms, the renewal and the rebuilding of a new kind of human being along more rational lines. De Crèvecoeur himself had completely embraced Americanism. He was a naturalized immigrant, and he saw America as a nation of immigrants, which of course it was, especially at this time. But there may be ways in which this letter and this book overstate certain points or tend in certain directions. And I want to point out some of the possible critiques or limitations of this in relation to, for example, Alexis de Tocqueville. Okay, for example, both Crèvecoeur and Tocqueville emphasize the equality of conditions in America. However, when discussing the equality of conditions, Tocqueville emphasizes the middle class. Remember, he says it was of fundamental importance that all of those on the Mayflower were from the middle classes, neither the aristocrats nor the destitute. De Crèvecoeur, on the other hand, constantly emphasizes the poverty of immigrants to America. They have nothing, he says. They must have nothing, in, I think, his telling, because then they can represent everything or anything. This is always a danger, especially when it comes to discussing America. This idea that America is just starting over on a blank slate from nothing. There may be even, to some extent, a kind of proto-Marxist aspect to this. If you remember, for example, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx says the proletariat is the class, quote, that has nothing. Nothing at all. Not that they're deprived, but they have nothing. Why does he say that? Well, one reason is so that they can therefore become the vessels of anything or everything, as he puts it. They are currently nothing, but they could become everything. I think there's something a bit similar going on in Crèvecoeur. And it's not clear that he's actually right about this. It is true that a number of immigrants who came to America, for example, came as indentured servants. A number of them came without a great deal of wealth. But most of them, especially the early settlers, had to pay their way in the new country. They knew they would have to work a trade or have some craft, and so many of them brought their skill sets over from their old countries and continued to practice the same trade that they had practiced in their old country. It is also not necessarily true that everyone left Europe because there was nothing for them in Europe. Crèvecoeur describes the old world in starkly negative terms. He says, quote, theirs was a country that had no bread. Their fields procured for them no harvest. They met with nothing but the frowns of the rich, the severity of the laws, with jails and punishments. They owned not a single foot of the extensive surface of the planet. Okay. Again, they have nothing. This is an exaggeration, at least in most cases. Makes it possible, though, for him to say that these immigrants can become a new race of men. Now, I'm not trying to say that Crèvecoeur, there are parts in this letter where he does acknowledge there are some continuities and some things that are carried over. For example, he constantly uses the analogy of plants because he's a farmer and he's going to use this plant analogy. Plants are rooted, he says. They require good soil, water, and light. They're adapted to their environments, and so they require certain environments to thrive. But Americans are transplants. They're plants that have been uprooted from their old soil and moved to a new setting. And in the process, they're going to have to learn to adapt to their new soil. And in doing so, they're going to become almost like different plants. He says on page 4, And he pioneers another metaphor here that we still use today, so this is noteworthy. He says on page 4 that individuals of all nations are melted into a new race of men. So this is this melting pot analogy, which I'm sure every one of you has heard and has heard used. We still use this today to describe Americans. This might be the first instance of the phrase melting pot. Now, to be fair to Crèvecoeur, he's not the only person who says this kind of thing. Think, for example, back to the character of Governor Hancock in that short Hawthorne story we read, Old Esther Dudley. Remember Hawthorne, when he encounters the old woman who comes out of the governor's house, he says to her, "Don't you know we're a new race of men?" Well, he says that. But as we discussed last time, there are other details in the story that kind of belie that actually maybe we're not as radically new and different as we say we are sometimes. We like to say that about ourselves as Americans, but it may not be strictly true. Crèvecoeur, though, again, is, and there's others too, he's not the only person who says this sort of thing. But, he really plays that up. Okay. He does say also, to be fair to him, right, in this letter that, quote, Americans are the Western pilgrims who are carrying along with them that great mass of arts, sciences, vigor, and industry, which began long since in the East. Okay, so they are the sort of next wave of something. They are the kind of wave of the future. But he does acknowledge at least that there are previous waves or some sort of previous thing against which they're reacting or moving on from. So I suppose in that way, he's not saying we're completely starting from scratch, but he really plays up the aspect of being new. Okay. Crèvecoeur also plays up the aspects of equality in America. And of course, this is something Tocqueville, in a broad sense, would agree with him on. There's no aristocracy territorially in America. There's no monarchy in America. Yet, you can contrast Crèvecoeur's descriptions to Tocqueville in the following way. Tocqueville is constantly talking about the communal side of Americans, right? The way that we have duties to other people, the way that religion puts boundaries on our imaginations and tells us that we shouldn't do everything we imagine. The way that Americans limit themselves through forms like law and lawyers. Well, Crèvecoeur's description here, I think, really is lacking in any sense that there is a notion of cooperation, a common good, a common purpose. He tends to very strongly emphasize the individual. When it comes to religion, likewise, Crèvecoeur, unlike Tocqueville, I think emphasizes the individual to a great extent. Right? Crèvecoeur says that, quote, religion demands but little of Americans. Okay, so this is maybe a little bit in line with the Great Awakening as well, right? The sense of the kind of individualized religious beliefs. Crèvecoeur acknowledges that Americans kind of are religious in the abstract, that religion in this generic sense is widespread in America. But when it comes to the actual dogmas, the actual doctrines, actual particular pious observances, we tend to be broad and ecumenical and individualized. Okay, you're going to see something like this again too, I think, in Ben Franklin. And here again is another connection to Franklin and perhaps even to some of the Great Awakening preachers like Whitefield, which is that Crèvecoeur emphasizes self-interest. Crèvecoeur says that Americans think in terms of self-interest, and there's a sense that following self-interest kind of leads to benefits for the community. He does not have, I think, as much of a clear sense as Tocqueville will that individualism can be detrimental to the community. It can also go along with it sometimes, but it can be detrimental. There's less of a sense here, for example, of like what George Washington talked about in his rules of civility, that sometimes virtue requires you to deny your individual self for the good of others. Crèvecoeur tends toward this view, which you'll see in Franklin, that self-denial is not the essence of virtue. That virtue is kind of coincidental, happily, wonderfully coincidental with self-interest. Okay. I'm going to say something also about the different kinds of treatments that he gives to different types of Americans. So Crèvecoeur acknowledges that there are different kinds of Americans. He says there are some who live near the coasts, and he says that those who live on the coasts are fishers and merchants. that there are those who live on farms who have settled a little bit more inland. And then he talks about the frontiersmen, the people who are going across the Appalachian Mountains and pushing forward into this new Western territory, the kind of people that the novel The Landbreakers is going to cover. Crèvecoeur's obvious preference is for those in the middle, not the people on the coast and not the frontiersmen and the pioneers. Now, this is somewhat jarring to read, especially because he's got some not great things to say about the hunters and the frontiersmen. I think especially because we're accustomed to having the frontiersmen romanticized. But for Crèvecoeur, the woods, the frontier is dangerous. It's a place where people might, for example, go native and marry Indian women, or find it hard to readapt to civilized life. And here, I think perhaps his Frenchness is coming out. He depicts the people on the frontier as, again, hyper individualistic, solitary hunter types, rather than settlers, rather than families, which was often who went onto the frontier. As you'll see in the Landbreakers, people went as units. They didn't just, it wasn't just single young men going onto the frontier. But Crèvecoeur kind of tends to exaggerate a little bit. I think it may be his Frenchness coming out. That there's this kind of French inclination to have a centralized government. If you remember, Tocqueville talks about this, that America, I should say, actually, sorry, centralized administration, whereas America, for Tocqueville, has a centralized government, but it does not have a centralized administration. But in France, they have both. They have centralized government and centralized administration. And if you remember what Tocqueville said about that, a centralized administration tries to kind of govern every little minute detail of local life. But that's not what we do in America. But I think it may not be wrong here to say Crèvecoeur has a little bit of a bias toward the French way of seeing things, that if you're not being directed by the centralized administration, it's anarchy, it's not good. There may not be quite enough of an appreciation for self-government. In fact, for people's ability to go out into the wilderness and still maintain civilization and not become savage. He says on page 5, for example, describing these frontiersmen, he says that they are, quote, remote from the power of example and check of shame. Many families exhibit the most hideous parts of our society. It's a pretty negative depiction. We'll see some of this in the Landbreakers. There was a lot of roughness on the frontier, but on the other hand, a lot of these families did try to carry vestiges of civilization with them. And so the Anglo-settler is different, I think, from the French settler. The attitude is different, that the Anglo-settler believes you can take the civilization with you and go outside of the reach of law and government and still be civilized. Whereas I think the French mind is just skeptical of that whole idea. What do you mean, people outside of the reach of centralized administration? They must be barbaric. So there's some little bit of prejudice here and bias, I think, based on his own French background. On the whole, I think Crèvecoeur is valuable because he offers to us a familiar vision of America. And you might say one side of America. He's a kind of Jeffersonian vision of America. It's a vision of America that is very liberating and transformative, the land of opportunity, as we might call it today. He says, for example, that the European, upon arriving in America, quote, no sooner breathes our air than he forms schemes and embarks on designs he never would have thought of in his own country, unquote. Okay, this is an interesting way to put it, especially when we have described America in this way in our history. We mean it as a land where those who were already inclined to industry and entrepreneurship are given the scope and the freedom to do what they are already inclined to do. But we don't mean, when we describe America as a land of opportunity, I think we generally don't mean that it's a place where people who never thought of such things can suddenly just magically snap their fingers and become industrious and entrepreneurial. We give them the opportunities, but they carried these things in them already, and it was the oppressive systems in their old countries that wouldn't let them live out these things. But Crèvecoeur, I don't know if Crèvecoeur is quite there, because he seems to think, again, this depiction of immigrants as all, on page 11, low and indigent, just impoverished. he doesn't seem to have as much of an appreciation for the fact that people are bringing this spirit, the skill sets of their trade with them, and that they're going to have scope to do these things in America, so much as he seems to kind of argue that America will transform people who never even thought of these things into people who can suddenly do them. I mean, that's a different. Do you see the difference there between those two ways of conceiving of what America can do? I think it's an important distinction. Okay. The last parts of the letter contain, I think, both a sort of limit to this principle, but also a kind of utopian impulse that give you a further sense of what Crèvecoeur is driving at. The first, I think this is interesting, is his discussion of Germans, Scots, and Irishmen as American colonists. He doesn't say much about the English, although they were the first ones and the largest group for a long time. Why doesn't he talk about the English? I don't know. They're just there. He just assumes they're there, but he wants to talk about these other groups. Okay. He says only about a third of the Irish will succeed in America, 2/3 of the Germans will, and 7 out of 12 Scots. Okay, this is a strange. Why does he put these national quotas on people? Again, if you're consistent with what he had said earlier in the letter, it doesn't matter where they come from, right? There's no real pre-existing character that's going to shape their success in America, because America has this soil that will just transform people kind of magically into productive and independent and free people. But then at the end of the letter, he says, oh, but it actually matters their national character, whether they're Irish or Scottish, that there's a difference between the Irish and the Scots and the Germans. Okay. I mean, he has the suggestion about the shepherds should be from the Scottish Isles of Orkney and the Hebrides Isles. Well, why does it matter that they're Scottish? What is it about Scottish people that he thinks is especially industrious and productive, or suited to tending sheep? Okay, so I don't know. He sort of belies a little bit of his earlier commitments, I think, toward the end of the letter. But again, at the end of the letter, he raises the question. Um, Whether or not, if this land is so harsh, America is going to be likely to produce people like that. Okay, so his tensions, I think, in this letter, and he's of a kind of split mind on some things. Nevertheless, putting that aside, this letter is still pretty remarkable because it gives us an early source of what becomes some of the main symbols of the American tradition when we talk about it. The land of opportunity, phrases everybody uses all the time. The melting pot, the idea of the industrious and grateful immigrant who leaves it all behind and starts anew. That's a very powerful and alluring image, and one that today continues to attract people to America. So it remains to you. I'm not going to say, you can like Crèvecoeur or not, or judge him in relation to Tocqueville and in relation to some of these other thinkers we're reading. But it remains up to you, I think, having read this, to judge the compatibility of what someone like a Crèvecoeur is saying with what some of the other thinkers we're reading in this class are saying. They're not all saying the same things. Is it a difference in emphasis, or is it really a difference in substance? I leave that question open for you to think about. All right, let's turn to Benjamin Franklin and the series of letters and excerpts I've assigned from him. Benjamin Franklin was, without a doubt, the man of his age. He was the exemplar of the age of the American Revolution, and really of the decade or two before the American Revolution. Everybody says this, and it's true. But what does it mean? Franklin was all about self-improvement, about doing well in the world, about being industrious and productive, and about moral virtue as a means of achieving success and happiness in this world. He was a printer, an inventor, a politician, a peculiarly kind of American nobleman, insofar as he had no title but worked his way up through hard work and through honesty to a position of great importance, from which he did many things that were magnanimous and philanthropic for his city and his state and his country. He did many of these things on his way up to that position of eminence. And so in this lecture, I'm not going to try to give you a complete overview of his autobiography. It's a great read. It's a fundamental American text. You should definitely, it's short too. You should definitely read the whole autobiography at some point. But I want to treat Franklin here in particular in relation to the question of virtue and what his virtues are and what relation they have perhaps to some of the other tables of virtues that we've talked about. For example, George Washington's rules of civility. How do Franklin's virtues differ? And they do differ from Washington's emphasis in terms of virtue. How do they differ from the Puritan set of virtues? And oh, yes, they differ from the Puritan understanding of virtue. Okay. That being said, first of all, I think something is missing if we take Franklin simply to be a man of his age who expressed his time. He was the preeminent man of his time, but he really is an American, even to this day. And you know, it's funny when I teach Franklin to students, a certain number of them at least really, really get it and like it in a way that they don't light up with some of the other founders. They read the other founders respectfully, with interest, but with Franklin, and when he talks about how to not waste your money, I mean, that's something students intuitively understand. You know, I mean, what would he say if he were around today? Don't go to Starbucks and spend $6.50 on some latte when you can make your coffee at home. You know, this is very tangible, very practical advice. That really still connects, I think, to a lot of people. I mean, you just look at how much is out there in American popular culture about how to make money, right? How to save properly. There's some book about, how to be a rich dad and a poor dad. I mean, this is a self-improvement. How to win friends and influence people is a famous self-help book by Dale Carnegie. So this Franklin-esque strain is clearly continues to be a real part of American culture. Okay. What Franklin is advocating, though, in terms of his virtues, is what Tocqueville will call, we'll see this in upcoming readings, self-interest rightly understood. Self-interest rightly understood. So it's not simple selfishness. Franklin and Tocqueville are not talking about just pursue vice in order to get ahead. No, it's that you pursue a particular kind of virtue, and that if it's done the right way, your self-interest and what gets you ahead will happily, fortunately, coincide with one another. You saw the beginnings of this in Crèvecoeur, but Franklin really spells it out. Okay. Franklin was a printer, as I mentioned, and so it's appropriate to perhaps start with some of those writings of his. He printed pamphlets and leaflets, an annual almanac for farmers. He printed some of the sermons of George Whitefield. He was friends with him, but he didn't much go in for Whitefield's religion himself. And he was not the kind of person who took his wisdom and his planning from almanacs. Okay, but he printed these things. A very cynical interpretation, I'm not advocating this, but a very cynical interpretation would be, well, Franklin was just a kind of salesman, or he was a kind of hustler or a manipulator. Who knew the nature of the masses, the people that would buy these sorts of things. He knew the kinds of things the public wanted to read, and so he printed them to make money. But that misses the mark. I think that's way too cynical. Franklin was a man of the people himself. He really shared a lot of their passions and interests. He was democratic. He was interested in practical things. He was not an ivory tower intellectual, although he was brilliant, but he didn't have the affectations of a professor sitting in their office and lecturing the people. I mean, he really was one of the people, and he really was a typical American in all the ways in which he was not a typical American, but in terms of his attitude and his character, there was something very typical about him. And you can find accounts of him in this regard in both scholarly and popular history. So at the same time, he was a statesman who took American republicanism seriously and who understood how difficult it was to pull off, but also how high and noble of an undertaking this was. He understood that freedom, both personal freedom in your own life and political freedom, Republican liberty, rested upon virtue. And in this, he is of accord with all the other founders. Again, however, we have to look a little more closely at this, because how exactly does he then define virtue? What kinds of virtues is he calling for? That he called for virtue, that he thought it was indispensable, is beyond dispute. There's a famous anecdote of him at the end of the Constitutional Convention of 1787. He comes out of the hall in Philadelphia, and a woman in the street says to him, "Oh, Mr. Franklin, what kind of government have you given us?" And his answer is supposed to have been, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." Well, why the "if you can keep it"? Because it's not going to keep itself. It requires virtue in the citizenry to keep it. And that's a project that's going to be the challenge of every generation. It's not just that the founders give us the Constitution and then we have it forever. It's going to take something in us to keep it going. So clearly, Franklin believes that there's a great deal of virtue that is presupposed on the part of the American public. Okay. That story probably did happen, actually. That's not a myth, like some of the George Washington myths. That story is almost certainly true, that conversation happened with Franklin. Okay, so what does he mean by virtue, though? He does not mean a Puritan ethic, as I mentioned earlier. His standards are quite lax by Puritan standards. You look at the way he defines some of those virtues on that very interesting list of 13 virtues. He made his own list of 13 virtues and gave definitions for them. And I think the definitions are really important. Pay attention to those definitions, because even though some of the words are the same, some of the terms of those virtues are the same. Justice, okay, temperance, okay, chastity. Those are classical virtues, are they not? Yes, but not in the way Franklin defines them. Look at the way he defines justice. The definition of justice for Franklin is an emphasis on not harming other people. That's a particular definition of justice. That is not Plato's definition of justice. That's not Aristotle's definition of justice. They have a much more all-encompassing definition of justice, rendering to each their due. Okay. So Franklin's definition is a different definition of the same word. You look at his definition of chastity. Okay. Franklin was not known for practicing chastity as, let's say, St. Augustine would have wanted someone to practice chastity. Franklin's definition of chastity, rarely use venery. Sorry, what? Rarely use venery except for health or offspring. Curious definition. What would it mean to use venery for health? Well, whatever that means exactly, that is not St. Augustine's definition of chastity. Okay, you can go down the list and you can look at his definitions of these virtues, and they're not the classical definitions. Not saying that they don't have uses. I'm not saying that they don't actually fit in some ways quite well this new emerging commercial society and this republic that we're trying to create. My point here is that for Franklin, in this regard, what he's calling on for Americans is not the same thing as what Plato or Aristotle would have called on in people to create the best political regime. It's not the same thing that the saints of Christian Europe would have called on people to embody. It's not the same things the Puritans would have called on people to embody. So you can go into Franklin's biography, but he was at home and even comfortable and thriving in the salons of Paris and London, in a certain kind of atmosphere of decadence. And his kind of charm and ease in those settings often won him favor and helped the American cause diplomatically. I mean, he's one of America's greatest diplomats of all time, helping to secure the French to join the War of Independence and help the American cause. Franklin collaborated with a number of these kind of decadent aristocrats. One guy is some guy named Sir Henry Dashwood, who's a British aristocrat. Franklin collaborated with him on a Bowdlerized Book of Common Prayer that was shorn of all references to sin, and hence the need for redemption or the resurrection of Christ. And of course, his dalliances in Paris are infamous. So the virtues that Franklin espouses are self-control, but self-control for the point of helping you get ahead, industriousness, which will contribute to society. Again, moderation. Let's look at that one. Another one of these virtues on his list of 13. How does he define moderation? quote, avoid extremes, forbear resenting injuries so much as you think they deserve. Okay, okay. Avoid extremes, forbear resenting injuries so much as you think they deserve. Sounds good. It's not bad advice. But I want to suggest this is not exactly the classical definition of moderation. Avoid extremes? Hmm. Aristotle, if you've read him, the Nicomachean Ethics, actually says that virtue sometimes means tacking toward one of the extremes. That virtue is not inherently always necessarily the avoiding of all extremes. It is a middle term between two extremes, but for Aristotle, that middle may be much farther to one side than it is to the other. And so sometimes true moderation may look like extremism to the world for Aristotle. That's not what Franklin is saying. Franklin is saying moderation is inherently always the 50% middle position. That you should never go toward one of the extremes, even if one of the extremes may be more correct, maybe more right in an ultimate sense. Moderation is for him always a kind of triangulation among the two different positions. Does that make sense? I mean, this is a subtle difference, but I think this is a real difference between, for example, how Aristotle defines moderation and how Franklin defines moderation. Okay. Temperance. I mean, let's look at temperance. Yeah, the Greeks, the Romans, the Christians all have said people should be temperate. But Franklin defines it as eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. Okay. You notice why? Well, why not? Because the effect it will have on you is that if you eat to dullness or drink to elevation, you might not be able to be as productive as you could be the next morning because you can't get out of bed. That's a different kind of emphasis from saying that temperance is important because it helps form your soul. Right? Franklin is not talking about forming your soul. He's talking about the reason you do all these things and you embody these virtues is because it will help you get ahead in the world. It'll make you a good, productive, respectable, bourgeois person. Now, that being said, Franklin, it's undoubted that he believes in hard work. He really believes in hard work. He espouses a belief in it and in self-improvement and success. You can look at his maxims in the preface to the 1757 edition of Poor Richard's Almanac. The most emblematic, these great sayings here, memorable phrases, again, some of which continue to be current in popular language. The single most memorable one, I think, is the phrase, God helps those who help themselves. That's originally from Ben Franklin, right? And think about that, right? God is not coming to save you. You've got to help yourself, and then God will kind of look at that and go, "Oh, that guy is a self-starter. That guy is working, so I'm going to give him some extra help." I mean, do you see the way that that's different from the Christian understanding of this stuff? The most revealing of these maxims, I think, is on page 224 when he says, quote, "In the affairs of this world, men are saved not by faith, but by the want of it." In the affairs of this world, men are saved not by faith, but by the want of it. Actually, you shouldn't depend on faith to get you out of a business dilemma, to help you start a business. That's actually not going to help you. You need to do things on your own. Don't bring in God. Don't depend on faith for worldly success. Okay. You have to do these things yourself. He says a little bit later, quote, "If you would like to have a faithful servant and one that you like, serve yourself." Again, a kind of anti-aristocratic bent to that, right? Don't have servants, right? But don't have servants because you're your own best boss. You should be your own boss. It's a very American sentiment. If we transpose this from economics to politics, these maxims, of course, have great impact. So the point of Franklin's emphasis here is to help secure the preconditions of independence, of freedom. That you have to start learning how to take responsibility and do things yourself. Govern yourself, we might say, like the American colonies have been governing themselves, and that you will eventually become, if you take this personal responsibility on and stop looking to God to help you, stop blaming other people, stop relying on servants to do your work for you. You do it yourself and you take responsibility and you work hard to achieve things. You will eventually become independent. In his letter from Father Abraham to his beloved son, Franklin says, "In passion strife, no medium you can have. You rule a master or submit a slave. You're either going to be self-starting and independent or a slave to somebody else. If you take on an excessive amount of debt, for example, Franklin will say elsewhere in his Poor Richard's Almanacs, you're a slave." And I mean, he's not wrong about that, right? I mean, if you have a massive pile of credit card debt, a mortgage you can't pay, the bank is going to foreclose on your house. You maybe go to jail eventually, or you'll be ruined. So he's not wrong. I mean, you've got to care about this kind of stuff. And if you want to maintain your independence as a human, as a person, you have to not be overly indebted to other people, whether that's the actual debtors in a bank or a credit card company, or whether that's other people to do your work for you, or other countries to govern you. Okay. He wrote a number of essays as well for his private philosophic literary club, which he called the Junto, which was something like an American version of a French salon. In one of these essays, which he wrote, it's called A Man of Sense. It's a bit of a Socratic dialogue. We again see Franklin's emphasis on action and not just on knowledge. He says in this essay, quote, "It is the knowing how to go about it and do it," unquote, in which virtue consists, not just the knowing. You don't just have to know what's good, you have to do it. For the Socratic teaching is that virtue is knowledge, right? Socrates taught that you had to know it first. But for Franklin, the relationship is different. There's no knowing unless it results in action. And if one doesn't act correctly, then that means one does not know correctly. Does this deny the possibility, does Franklin deny the possibility then of something like a failure of will? That somebody could know perfectly well what's right and wrong and fail to do it? I don't know. Is his theory tending in that direction? Because as he says in his essay on self-denial not being the essence of virtue, virtue is not a matter of denying one's inclinations. Again, seems like a big break from the Christian and the classical understanding. Virtue is not a matter of denying your inclinations, but rather of knowing you're good and then doing it because you know it. Okay. This leads, again, I think, to Franklin's emphasis on interest and utility. As he writes in his Socratic dialogue, quote, "Virtue is really the true interest of all men, but to know one's interest, one must have a sense of what is useful to him. A man of sense will not spend his time in learning such sciences as will probably be useless to him. What is useful is what may contribute to happiness," unquote. So learning has to be useful because it has to result in action. So there's a utility standard that comes in as the requirement now for what counts as the kind of education you should receive. So you can see here as well the way that this discussion of virtue is inherently tied to a discussion of education, and what kind of virtues you value inevitably lead you to construct a form of education that will try to inculcate those virtues and discourage the opposite of those virtues. Okay. Final point here is that in this essay, Self-Denial, Not the Essence of Virtue, Franklin says that people have tended to take courage, the virtue of courage, as the model for the virtues, because it's most evident that courage requires virtue to overcome a passion. In this case, let's say fear, to act virtuously. So the more you're afraid, the more you're inclined to run, and the greater your courage is in not running away. Franklin ridicules this notion. Frankly, some of the examples are a little laughable, but he says the effect of what he's saying is that the more virtuous we are, the weaker any temptation will be. Okay, that's interesting as a sort of reversal of the parable of the workers, where Franklin says, if I have two journeymen, one naturally industrious and the other idle, both perform a day's work equally good, ought I to give the latter the most wages? This is a very slight adjustment, but it's telling. In Franklin's account of virtue, one does not take stock of intention or the heart, but of the result. So along with Franklin's other writings is a kind of useful teaching for America's revolutionary minds because there's a thoroughgoing this worldliness to it. God calls us to the things of this world, and we are to pursue the things of this world zealously. And if vice is bad for us, it's bad for us in this world. Again, so we're not going to evaluate this with reference to some transcendent standard. It's going to be all about the imminent results of our action. Does it help you get ahead or does it not? In his autobiography, Franklin says at one point that, quote, "Vicious actions are not hurtful because they are forbidden, but forbidden because they are hurtful." That just about says it all, doesn't it? That the ultimate reason you should be virtuous is because you'll be hurt by not being virtuous, rather than the other way around, which is a classical understanding, which would say the reason you should be virtuous is because it's the right thing to do. And in fact, doing the right thing is good for your soul, but it may in fact hurt your body or hurt your success in this world. Look at what happened to Socrates. Look at what happened to Jesus Christ. Look at what happened to any number of other figures who stood up against a government and who stood for something true against what actually got them ahead. That's not Franklin's interest. His interest, again, is in the coincidence of self-interest and virtue. And so a lot of what he writes here is to try to rectify and to try to sort of square self-interest and virtue. There's not a lot of appreciation here for the idea that sometimes pursuing virtue, doing the right thing, is going to cost you a whole lot. But if you look at the record, if you look at history, oftentimes it does cost you a lot to be virtuous. So this is something different. We might sum this up by saying that the kinds of virtues Franklin is advocating for here are, and I used this word earlier, the bourgeois virtues. The bourgeois virtues. The virtues of the sort of middle class, upper middle class, independent, self-starters who want to win friends and influence people in this world. Okay. There's more I could say about Franklin, especially in terms of his religion. He's not especially religious, and I think here you see a step away from even the Whitefields and even the Jonathan Edwards, who themselves are a step away from Puritanism. Franklin says he respects all religions, but he doesn't really care at all about dogma. He's not interested. He says at one point in the autobiography that he hopes his autobiography will be read with profit by followers of all religions. So this is a very broadly ecumenical text. You can maybe see something like this reflected in the Declaration of Independence's reference to nature's God, a very ecumenical approach that is, again, I think a step away even from the Great Awakening. Okay, so we're going really in the direction now of secularizing our way of thinking about things like virtue in the American tradition. And I think it's interesting to note, I'll just close with this about Franklin. If you read the whole autobiography, you find out that Franklin made his fortune in Philadelphia. He's famously a citizen of Philadelphia. But he wasn't born in Philadelphia. Do you know where he was born? Go and read his autobiography, or maybe if you've been to this city, you've seen the site of Ben Franklin's birthplace. He was born in Boston. And then at age 17, he set out on a journey by himself, walked and traveled on ferries and horseback all the way down from Boston to Philadelphia to make his fortune as a young man. I think that direction of travel is very revealing, not just as a biographical detail, but as a statement about kind of where American thinking is going, away from Massachusetts, away from Puritanism, away from this religious city on a hill community, toward the broad, tolerant, secular, commercial, worldly city of Philadelphia. All right, let's turn to the Jefferson and Adams writings on education. I'm not going to summarize every single point in these readings, but there are a number of high points that I want to hit and really emphasize as part of this lecture. So first, I think it's worth noting, before I get into Jefferson's letter to Henry Lee here, that both Jefferson and Adams, as different as they are, you might say that Thomas Jefferson represents the left wing of the American Revolution and John Adams represents the right wing. Nevertheless, they have a lot in common when it comes to the need for education, that education is central to forming citizens for this new republic. And furthermore, that's not something that necessarily the federal government is going to do, but that it could and should be something that the state governments and local governments engage in. So that's the proper level at which education is going to be promoted. Okay. Um, Both of their recommendations for education, I think the kinds of things they emphasize, also show that they don't really agree with Crèvecoeur, for example, that Americans are an entirely new race of men. In fact, it's imperative, they both think, that we learn from the wisdom of the past, that we learn from the experiences of the Greeks and the Romans, from European history, and from more modern thinkers and events. So we have to go back into the past. We can't base an education simply on our own experience as Americans. It would be too limiting. So to illustrate this, I want to talk for a minute about this letter to Henry Lee. It's very short, but I think, for my money, this is a supremely important text in the American tradition. In fact, every time when I teach undergraduates and I teach the Declaration of Independence, I make them read this letter along with the Declaration of Independence. Why? Okay. It dispels, I think it absolutely blows out of the water a certain kind of popular, shallow understanding of what the Declaration of Independence is and where the ideas in it come from, and by extension, what makes the American tradition what it is. That shallow idea being, as we discussed last time, that the founders just kind of made it all up out of their heads in 1776, and maybe a more advanced version of that would be, well, they just kind of copied like John Locke and some Enlightenment philosophy, and then they just repeated that. And so Americans are making a clean break, and they're going out of the state of nature and creating something new. Okay. It's way more complicated than that. And just look at this letter. And by the way, this letter is from Thomas Jefferson. This is not a scholar's interpretation of what the Declaration of Independence means. This is not speculation about maybe he thought this, maybe he didn't. That gets very dicey. This is literally what he said. The man who wrote it telling us explicitly what was going through his head when he wrote those famous words in the Declaration. From the horse's mouth, here it is. He says to Henry Lee, quote, "This was the object of the Declaration of Independence." And I've highlighted this next part, not to find out new principles or new arguments never before thought of. Not merely to say things which had never been said before, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject, in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent, neither aiming at originality of principle or sentiment, nor yet copied from any particular and previous writing. Bold this part. It was intended to be an expression of the American mind. Okay, think about what that means. An expression of the American mind. It's a synthesis. It's, you might say, a melting pot of several different influences and ideas. And think about what makes up someone's mind, right? All the education you've received over the course of your life has somehow influenced your mind, the way you think and the way you see the world. And maybe some people more than others, but it's not any one particular source. If by the time you graduate college, you can't just say, well, I owe everything I know to Mr. Smith in third grade or to one professor you had in college. It's never one single influence. It's a melting of many different influences together. And some of them might fit better than others, but you've got to acknowledge the sort of multifarious origins of the way that we see the world. And Jefferson here is saying this is true of nations and of national minds, that our nation has a national mind, and the American mind is an amalgam of many different influences. It's not just one thing. So look at what he says. Where did he get the ideas in the Declaration of Independence? From him himself. Here's what he says. All its authority rests then on the harmonizing sentiments of the day, whether expressed in conversations, in letters, in printed essays, or in the elementary books of public right. And by the way, notice he's not just saying it came from philosophy books. He's not just saying it came from academic sources. He says that these ideas also were current in conversations. in letters, in printed essays. And then who does he name? If you want some philosophers, he gives you four philosophers that he singles out as especially important to understanding the Declaration: Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, and Sidney. Right. John Locke is on this list. He's important. He's one of the four, but he's not the only one. And it's not only modern philosophers. It's not only Enlightenment philosophers. Sidney was probably the most obscure one on this list, is a British Republican writer. Locke, you know who he is. Cicero is an ancient Roman. Aristotle is an ancient Greek. So there's a whole bunch of influences, and Jefferson says, look, it's more than even just these four. It was conversations. It was the stuff that was in the air and that was shaping our minds. And then he names four different people. But again, to this earlier discussion about how new are Americans, look, not to find out new principles or new arguments never before thought of. I mean, he's saying, I didn't come up with all these ideas. These ideas that all men are created equal, that's not my invention. That's not even John Locke's invention. That's the result of many different influences. All the other ideas about the rule of law, about liberty, about safety and happiness being the end of government, about the Creator endowing us with certain rights, about the need for one people to justify their break to the world. All of these things come from many different sources. So this, I mean, to my mind, this letter is one of the most important texts in when I teach principles of American politics. And it just goes against, I think, and just so clear. I mean, you can't get clearer evidence than this, that the certain kind of popular understanding of the founding and of the Declaration is way too shallow and needs to be complemented and nuanced like this. So I highly recommend teaching this letter. And I think it's one of Jefferson's most informative letters. All right, finally, let's talk about John Adams and these letters. Start with a 1777 letter to his son, John Quincy, who of course would also become a future president of the United States. This letter describes books that he wants his son to read as part of his formation, and he names two figures in particular: Thucydides, ancient Greek historian of the Peloponnesian War, and Thomas Hobbes, the early modern English philosopher of the state and of political power. It's very interesting that he picks these two philosophers. He's not necessarily, as you see in the letter, endorsing everything in these authors, in Hobbes in particular. And you'll see his antipathy to Hobbes come out again in a later letter. But he says of Thomas Hobbes to his son that, quote, "one will find a great deal of mischievous philosophy." So there's a lot of problematic arguments in Hobbes. As he says later in his letter to Benjamin Rush in 1810, again, quote, "Hobbes calumniated the classics because they filled young men's heads with ideas of liberty and excited them to rebellion against Leviathan," unquote. Okay, so then why recommend that his impressionable son read an author as problematic as Hobbes? I think it's because it's important to know what we're up against. And so what Adams is trying to suggest here is that education should be conducted, certainly should expose young Americans to ideas that are not the ones that we embody, right? So Adams is not simply saying that American education should only reinforce good things. It should only teach them positive examples, right? Adams has a trust here, I think, in the capacity of his son and in other young Americans to engage with really problematic philosophers and still learn something from them. And in a sense, this idea that if Hobbes, somebody like Hobbes, is so opposed to the idea of liberty, which America is all about, well, then we'd better read Hobbes to know what his arguments are against liberty so that we can be better prepared to argue with him. And so that we can not be shocked or surprised when we encounter these things out there in the real world. Because after all, there are other states on earth that are not America that are devoted to the ideas of Thomas Hobbes, even if we scorn those ideas here. Okay. Who else does he talk about? In the 1781 letter, he mentions learning, quote, in the company with Sallust, Cicero, there's Cicero again, Tacitus, and Livy. He says, in their company, quote, you will learn wisdom and virtue. Again, the ancients, we've got to go back to the Greeks and the Romans. Right? We're not starting from scratch. You've got a lot of reading to do, all of these ancient authors, and in particular, if possible, in their language. Throughout these letters, he praises learning Greek and Latin, and he opposes people who are against Americans learning these so-called dead languages. He says at the end of this letter, the end of the letter from 1781, comment on the purpose of education to his son. He says, "You will ever remember that all the end of study is to make you a good man and a useful citizen." So education has this kind of dual purpose for Adams. It's to both make you a better person as a man, and it's also to make you a useful citizen. So there's a political and a personal dimension to education. But in order to form people in the proper way, there has to be a specific curriculum. I mean, Adams is not saying read whatever you want. Adams is not saying only read contemporaries. You have to actually set certain kind of arduous tasks for yourself and read challenging authors, very old authors who presumably still have things to say that are relevant to us. Even though we're Americans, we're not exempt from the human condition. And so whatever is true in Cicero is going to be applicable to Americans. And again, to familiarize yourself not only with the good guys, but also with the bad guys. You've got to familiarize yourself with Hobbes so that we can be prepared to defend liberty better, because Hobbes is a great opponent of liberty, at least according to Adams. Okay. There's this 1810 letter to Benjamin Rush where he elaborates on more of his ideas on education. Benjamin Rush, I should say, he's another founder. I could have assigned him in this section as well. But Rush was a friend of Ben Franklin's, actually, very good friends, Philadelphia doctor and inventor named Benjamin Rush. And you see this in this letter that he had invented a tranquilizer. It was a great discovery. But Rush also proposed schemes of education for Americans, for people in this new country. And a signature of Benjamin Rush's proposal for American education is that we would drop the dead languages. We would drop these classics from Greece and Rome because they're not really relevant to us anymore as Americans in the modern world. Well, Adams has an opinion about that, and he says, totally wrong. He says, it's a really funny line in this letter. He says, quote, "If I were possessed of sovereign power over your hospital, provided I could do it secretly so that no mortal should know it but you and I would put you into your own tranquilizer till I cured you of your fanaticism against Greek and Latin." Okay, so I want to, stick you with a needle and inject you with something that'll make you cure you of your opposition to the classics. And he goes on, again, as I said, this is worth rereading, that Hobbes calumniated the classics because they filled young men's heads with ideas of liberty and excited them to rebellion against Leviathan. So studying the classics is defending liberty. It's vital to do this to defend our own modern republic. You've got to study the ancient Republican writers. You've got to study their approach to virtue. Now, there's one other thing in this letter I want to highlight, which he also was critical of Rush for. Rush advocates for studying. It's an interesting debate because this comes up again and again today in debates over curricula. Why should we emphasize the Western tradition? Why don't we emphasize global tradition, for example? After all, there are a lot of interesting and wise writers in other global traditions. The West does not have a monopoly on this kind of thing. But Adams's answer is that no, in fact, this education needs to be a Western-oriented education. Why? It ties back to this idea of liberty. And Adams argues that you do not get the central emphasis on liberty in Eastern writers that you have in Western writers. And so he says, if you want to have an education for someone like, Alexander the Great, Caesar, or a Napoleon, and Napoleon is currently running France at the time he's writing this, he says, yeah, maybe then you would indulge in some of these Eastern writers. But if you want to make people form to defend liberty, it has to be a Western-oriented education. Okay, he says they should learn Greek and Latin rather than, he says, Arabic. Interesting comment. Okay, and again, this is a debate I think that continues to our own time about what exactly the canon should include, what exactly the orientation of a liberal arts education ought to be. Okay. Final letter. I want to talk briefly about this letter from 1783 to the Abbé de Mably, who was a French writer who had undertaken, this is 1783, so the American Revolution just ended, right? And Abbé de Mably is this French writer who's trying to write already a history of the American Revolution. And Adams says that's way too premature. First of all, you really can't do that yet. It's too soon. It just ended. And he mentions that some of the most important documents from the revolution are secret and have not been released yet. So we've got to get the files organized and released, and we're not there yet. But then he says, and this is really the thrust of his criticism, is that, Abbé de Mably, you're trying to write this history to serve revolutionary purposes in France. But you've got to be very careful about this. And Adams says, if you really want to understand the American Revolution, you can't just understand it as a self-contained event that came out of nowhere, that has nothing to do with anything from the past. Again, highlighting the same themes we've been discussing. Adams says that if you want to write such a history, I suggest you divide the history of the Revolution into 4 periods. What's the first period? The first period, Adams says, should begin with the first colonies in the 1600s. Just like Tocqueville, right? Tocqueville starts all the way back in 1607, 1619, 1620, and Adams concurs. Adams says you should start with the first colonies up through 1761, when the controversy with Great Britain began. Then you would have a second period, 1761 to 1775, which is this period in which there was a debate on paper or in rhetoric between the colonies and the British. Then, of course, in 1775, you get the third period when blood is actually shed at the battles of Lexington and Concord, and the war actually breaks out. This goes from being a theoretical paper conflict to a real physical conflict, violent conflict. And then Adams says period number 4 should be from 1778 up to 1783, when treaty negotiations were going on with various European powers. Okay, so again, you've got to understand that the American Revolution is a lot more than just the Declaration of Independence or the Revolution itself. It's bracketed by these other periods in history. And let me just read something from his discussion of this proposed first period in American history. He says, quote, "Without a distinct knowledge of the history of the colonies in the first period, a writer will find himself constantly puzzled. To acquire a competent knowledge of the first period, one must read all the charters to colonies and the commissions and instructions to governors, all the law books of the several colonies, and 13 folio volumes of dry statutes." This is precisely what this course is trying to do, teaching the American tradition. And John Adams agrees with it. He says you've got to read the charters of the colonies going back to the 1600s if you really want to understand the American Revolution. Okay. He further elaborates by saying that if you study that first period, that colonial era, which is vital, you've also got to study 4 particular things in the colonial period. What are those 4 things? 1, the townships. That's exactly what Tocqueville says. Adams says, quote, "The consequences of this institution," meaning the township, "has been that all the inhabitants have acquired from their infancy a habit of debating, deliberating, and judging public affairs. It was in these town meetings that the sentiments of the people were first formed." That's exactly what Tocqueville says. Institution number 2 that you've got to study, the churches. Adams says the churches, every town had at least one church, some had more than one. They were Protestant ministers who were in many cases popularly chosen. And they were married and they were kind of among the people. So it's a different kind of clergy, for example, than a Catholic priest, right? Catholic priests are not married. They are a kind of separate clerical class. But Adams is saying that the Protestant ministers in the churches in these towns are essential to understanding the Revolution. He says, quote, "They are a wise and virtuous and pious set of men because they exemplify the best in the people. They exemplify the kinds of piety and high kind of religious virtues, not self-interest, not Franklin's virtues, but religious virtues here, pious virtues. and that they are the exemplars of this in the early period, in the colonial period. Institution number 3 you've got to study, Adams says, are the schools. From the earliest days, education was fundamental in the American colonies. Every town, just like it had a church, had a schoolhouse that was supported by the state and local governments. And he says these schoolhouses taught, look at what he says, what they taught: reading, writing, arithmetic, and the rudiments of Latin and Greek. So those dead languages that Benjamin Rush wants to get rid of, Adams says, is actually foundational to educating Americans and even to educating them and preparing them for the American Revolution. Okay. Finally, 4th institution, interesting point. He says the 4th one you've got to study is the militia. What was the militia? It was an obligation. As Adams writes, quote, every male inhabitant between 16 and 60 years of age is enrolled in a company and regiment of the militia. You had to do your militia duty in the way that people today are called upon to do jury duty. It's not something you can refuse. It's an obligation you have to do as a part of the conditions of being a citizen. And so men between 16 and 60 had to go to these mustering grounds and assemble and drill with their fellow townsmen, ordinary citizens. These are not professional soldiers. The militia is not the professional army. These are regular people who were required to go to military drills every once in a while as a way of practicing for the defense of their community. Well, that obviously laid the groundwork as well for the American Revolution. Okay. Final point here, just somebody mentioned this, we've talked about this a few times, this right to keep and bear arms and the extent to which early Americans believed in rights in the way we do. Well, notice what Adams says about this. The members of the militia, which again is every adult male, did not have the right to keep and bear arms. They were required to do so. They had the obligation to do so, and not just to maintain a rifle in good working order, but to keep horns of powder, bullets, and other kinds of implements and tools that would help them keep their rifles in good working order and enable them to defend themselves if need be. So again, it's not just a right in the way we think about rights. It was actually a requirement. It was a communal obligation. Like jury duty, to have a gun, keep it in working order, and go to these militia drills. Okay, so this letter by Adams, I think, really fascinating, and it really reinforces some of what Tocqueville has already told us and some of the emphasis that we're trying to put on things in this class. Okay, I'm going to stop there. There's more I could say, but I will stop. Please let me know if you have questions before you take the quiz, and so be sure to do that today as well before 11:59 tonight. All right, thank you, and have a good weekend.